Have you ever felt too weak to go on, as if life's challenges were too great to face alone? Today, we're going to talk about the real secret to being strong and resilient, a strength that doesn't just come from you, but from a deep and transforming connection with God. In this video, we're going to dive into God's powerful promises. This video is not just about inspiration, but about transformation. I want you to leave here knowing that you don't have to face the storms alone, that there is a fortress, a refuge, and an inexhaustible source of strength in God waiting for you. But before we start, I want to ask you something special. Leave the phrase, "Lord, be my fortress and my strength at all times," in the comments. When you comment, it's not just an interaction, it's an affirmation of faith, a way of declaring that you are seeking God's strength and are willing to let Him be your rock. What's more, it helps spread this message to more people who also need to hear this truth. So comment now, and let's get started together. Number 1. The source of strength. Philippians 4:13 is one of the most well-known and frequently quoted verses in the Bible. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This verse is often interpreted as a kind of motivational phrase, telling us that we can achieve anything as long as we work hard and trust in God. But when we delve into the true context of what Paul was saying, we realize that there is a much deeper lesson about strength and contentment. Paul wrote these words while he was in a very difficult situation. He was imprisoned, deprived of his freedom, and had every reason to feel discouraged or helpless. Yet he writes to the Philippians about something essential: the secret of living contentedly, whether in times of plenty or in times of scarcity. Paul had already experienced both prosperity and need, but what he had learned was that true peace and contentment did not come from the circumstances around him, but from Christ dwelling in him. When he says, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me," Paul is not referring to a supernatural ability to conquer all the things he desires, but rather to the ability to face any situation, whether good or bad, through the strength that comes from Jesus. Paul's strength was not in favorable circumstances, but in the certainty that Christ was with him in every situation. The strength he spoke of was that which came from the Lord himself, a strength that went beyond what he, in his humanity, could muster on his own. We can imagine life as a roller coaster, full of ups and downs. There are times when we are at the top, everything seems to be going well, and we feel in control. At other times, we are taken on sudden descents, and fear and insecurity envelop us. What Paul teaches us is that at any point on the roller coaster, our stability does not depend on the mountain itself or our ability to cope with it, but on the God who holds our hearts. This strength he speaks of is like a constant engine within us, a sustaining force that doesn't abandon us even in the most difficult times. Jesus is the one who strengthens us, and this teaches us something very important. True strength is not ours, it is His. When we put our trust in Christ, we stop trying to fight our battles alone. Instead, we anchor ourselves in the one who has already overcome the world. It's like trying to carry a heavy burden for a long way. Eventually, our strength fails and we collapse from exhaustion. But when we invite Christ to carry that burden with us, He helps us bear the weight, and we find a relief and peace that goes beyond understanding. The beauty of Philippians 4:13 is that it invites us to a new way of living, a life where our strength is not limited by what we can do alone. It is an invitation to a divine partnership, where every step we take is sustained by a strength that does not depend on our ability, but on God's love and power. Christ in us is the hope of glory and is also the inexhaustible source of strength for our most difficult days and toughest challenges. So when we face situations that seem unbearable, let's remember Paul's words. We don't have to be strong on our own, because the one who is in us is strong. We can face all things, not because we are invincible, but because Christ, in his grace, strengthens us and enables us to carry on. He is the fountain that never runs dry, the hand that never lets go, and the presence that never abandons us. Number 2. The call not to fear. At various times in the Bible, God calls us not to fear, and this call is always accompanied by a promise, his constant presence. In Isaiah 41:10, God says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God." In Joshua 1:9, the Lord encourages Joshua by saying, "Be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." These passages are powerful reminders that even in the most challenging times, we are not alone. Our strength and courage come from the certainty that God is with us. Fear is a natural and often unavoidable emotion. Who hasn't felt fear when faced with the unknown or adversity that comes without warning? Fear in itself is not a problem, it is part of our humanity. However, God invites us to a life where fear does not dictate our actions, where it does not paralyze us or prevent us from moving forward. The secret to living without being overwhelmed by fear lies not in avoiding every difficult situation, but in having the certainty that whatever happens, God will be by our side. In Isaiah 41:10, the promise is clear, "Fear not, for I am with you." This simple phrase has immense power. Think of a small child who is facing something that frightens them. A dark room, for example. As soon as they hold their parent's hand, the fear loses its power. What has changed? Not the dark room, but the certainty that they are no longer alone. In the same way, God reminds us that He is always by our side. The world can be a scary and uncertain place, but His presence gives us the courage we need to get through the toughest times. In Joshua 1:9, God encourages Joshua to be strong and courageous. It's worth remembering that Joshua was about to lead the people of Israel on a huge mission full of challenges. He was taking over from Moses, and the responsibility was enormous. Certainly Joshua could feel fear, doubt, and a sense of helplessness, but God didn't ask Joshua to be strong because he was capable on his own. God asked him to be strong and courageous because He, the Lord Himself, would be with him wherever he went. It wasn't about Joshua's abilities, but about God's constant presence. This is one of the greatest lessons about resilience. Resilience doesn't mean the absence of difficulties or the ability to face them on your own. Being resilient means having the certainty that, regardless of the size of the storm, God is there, firmly by our side. It is this presence that gives us the strength to carry on, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart. It is the voice of the Father saying, "Fear not, I am with you." Christian resilience is based on this trust. Not that we have all the answers or all the strength, but that the one who walks beside us is greater than any challenge. Imagine that our life is like crossing a long desert. Sometimes we feel exhausted, dehydrated, and without the strength to go on. But if we know that there is a spring of water just ahead and that someone will guide us there, then we will have reason to keep going even if our feet are tired. The promise of God's presence is like that water. It renews our strength, it gives us direction and inspires us to keep going. So God calls us not to fear, because He knows that with Him by our side, we can get through any situation. It's not about avoiding deserts, but knowing that there is a powerful and loving presence that accompanies us. Whether in moments of uncertainty or in life's most intense battles, fear not, for I am with you, is the anchor that keeps us firm. God's presence transforms us, gives us courage, and makes us resilient. We can face the unknown, the difficulties, and the headwinds because the one who created the universe has chosen to walk with us. This, more than anything else, is what makes us truly strong and able to resist. Number 3, the transformation of weakness into strength. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, Paul shares one of the most profound and yet paradoxical truths of the Christian faith. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. These words were spoken to Paul by the Lord Himself in response to a situation of great distress he was facing, something he described as a thorn in the flesh. Although Paul had asked God to remove this thorn, the answer he received was not the removal of the difficulty, but rather a promise of sufficient grace and a revelation of God's power in the midst of his weaknesses. What we have here is one of the greatest paradoxes of the Christian life. God's power is perfected precisely in our moments of weakness. At first glance, this may seem contrary to human logic. When we think of power, we usually imagine strength, invincibility, and superior abilities. But God's power doesn't follow the logic of the world. God doesn't expect us to be flawless superheroes. On the contrary, He wants us to recognize our humanity, our limits, and our inability to do everything on our own. When Paul speaks of his weaknesses, he is not lamenting, but celebrating a fundamental principle of faith. Weakness is not something to be hidden or ignored. It is a meeting point between who we are and what God can do in us. It is precisely in recognizing our weakness that God's grace manifests itself. When we stop trusting in our own strength and surrender to the sufficiency of divine grace, we discover a power that is not ours, but is available to us. We can imagine this reality through the metaphor of a sail and the wind. When we try to be strong on our own, we are like a candle trying to generate light and heat from something that is already running out. But when we recognize our limitations and let God act, we are like a candle that opens up to the wind. The wind, God's grace, blows and keeps the flame burning, even when it seems that our own strength is no longer enough. God's power is that wind that keeps us shining and enduring, even when the wax of our own ability seems to be melting. Recognizing our own weaknesses, then, is an act of profound courage. It may seem difficult because we live in a society that constantly teaches us not to show vulnerability. Weakness is often seen as a defect or a lack of value. However, the gospel calls us to a completely different approach. What the world sees as weakness, God sees as an opportunity to demonstrate His power. The more we admit that we are not self-sufficient, the more we make room for Him to act powerfully in our lives. In practice, recognizing our weaknesses means stopping pretending that we have everything under control. It means confessing first to ourselves, then to God, and often also to the people around us, that we can't carry certain burdens alone. This can be as simple as admitting that we need help, or as profound as giving ourselves up in prayer, asking God to give us strength where we know we are failing. In doing so, we begin to rely more on His grace than on our own ability, and that's where true resilience comes in. Resilience is not about being an unshakable rock, but about being flexible enough to bend without breaking, because we trust in God's strength and not just our own. When we are willing to be vulnerable, to depend on God, and trust that His grace is sufficient, we are transformed. Our weakness becomes a place of power, not because we become strong on our own, but because God works through us. So, as we face our limitations and difficulties, let's remember God's promise. My grace is sufficient for you. His words are an invitation to stop struggling alone and allow Him to be our strength. Our weakness is the starting point for a divine transformation. And so, in every challenge, every moment of tiredness or uncertainty, we can rest in the certainty that God's strength is being perfected in us. In the end, we are not strong because we have no weaknesses, but because our strength comes from God's abundant and inexhaustible grace. And that is the true beauty of Christian resilience. Number 4. Strength that comes from hope in God. Isaiah 40:31 brings us a promise that is both inspiring and comforting. But those who hope in the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. In this verse, we clearly see how God invites us to find strength through hope and patience, something that goes far beyond our human efforts. Waiting on God is not a kind of passive waiting, like someone who sits around waiting for something to just happen. On the contrary, waiting on the Lord involves active trust, an act of surrender and dependence that allows us to rest and trust that God is in control, even when we don't see immediate answers. Waiting is knowing that there is a bigger plan, even if we only see fragments of it now. And it is in this confident waiting that our strength is renewed. Sometimes it's hard to wait. We live in a culture of haste, where everything seems to need to be instantaneous. We want quick solutions, immediate changes, ready-made answers. But Isaiah reminds us that true renewal of strength doesn't come from quick fixes, but from a heart willing to trust and wait on the Lord. When we wait on Him, we allow God to work in us and through us, in His time, which is perfect. This patience not only sustains us, but also renews us. It gives us a new vigor, a new perspective, and a strength that we can't find in our own efforts. Isaiah uses the metaphor of the eagle to give us a clear picture of the kind of strength that comes from God. Eagles are known for their unique ability to fly high and, more interestingly, to use wind currents to fly over storms. When a storm approaches, instead of fleeing, the eagle soars above it. It doesn't fight the wind. It takes advantage of the wind to soar even higher. In the same way, when we wait on the Lord, we are like eagles. It doesn't mean that the storms of life disappear, but rather that we find in God the ability to soar above them, to see them from a higher perspective, sustained by His power and presence. This image is powerful because it shows us that God doesn't promise us the absence of storms, but gives us the ability to soar above them. The wind that seemed to be a threat becomes, with God's strength, what makes us go higher. Hope in the Lord transforms our difficulties into opportunities for growth. In moments of waiting, we are renewed and prepared to soar like eagles, seeing life from the divine perspective, from above and not just under the weight of our problems. It's interesting to think that in nature, the eagle also goes through periods of renewal. At a certain point in its life, it removes its old feathers so that new ones can grow, a painful but necessary process so that it can continue to fly vigorously. We often need to go through processes of renewal. When we wait on God, He helps us to strip off the old, fears, weariness, doubts, and clothe us with the new hope, strength, and courage. This process of waiting can be uncomfortable, but it is necessary so that we can fly even higher. Therefore, the strength that comes from hope in God is a strength that is not limited to what we see or feel at the moment. It is a strength that is based on the certainty that God is always acting on our behalf, even when the result is not yet visible. Waiting on the Lord gives us the ability to not only withstand contrary winds, but to use those winds to lift us up, just as eagles do. It gives us the courage to keep running without getting tired and to walk without fainting. If you feel tired, that your strength is running out, remember Isaiah's invitation. Wait on the Lord. It's not a waiting of giving up, but of renewal. God promises that by doing so, you will be like the eagle, soaring above the storms, renewed, restored, and full of vigor. In waiting, we find a God who not only gives us strength, but who makes us go beyond what we could have imagined, overcoming obstacles and adversity through the hope that only He can offer. Number 5. The role of perseverance in trials. In James 1:2-4, we find a statement that challenges our way of looking at problems and difficulties. Consider it a source of great joy that you are going through various trials. At first, these words seem contrary to what we naturally experience. How can we find joy in the midst of difficulties? How can something so painful and exhausting be a source of contentment? However, James offers us a perspective that can only be understood in the light of faith and trust in God. When we face trials, our natural reaction is to try to avoid them, solve them as quickly as possible, or regret having to go through them. James, however, invites us to look at trials as opportunities, not just challenges to overcome, but opportunities to grow, mature, and become stronger. He tells us that trials produce perseverance, and this perseverance is fundamental to shaping our character and making us more like Christ. The word perseverance carries with it the idea of standing firm, of continuing despite difficulties. It's not just about surviving the challenge, but about becoming stronger as we go through it. When we face difficulties and decide to trust in God, something powerful happens inside us. We develop a strength that cannot be conquered in times of ease. It's like a muscle that, in order to be strengthened, needs to be exercised, and this exercise often involves resistance and effort. In the same way, our faith grows and strengthens when it is tested. Jesus also taught us to trust God at all times, including the most difficult, because there is always a greater purpose. When He faced the cross, He knew that there was a purpose beyond the pain, the salvation of humanity. He didn't avoid suffering, but with perseverance and trust in the Father's plan, He went through it and overcame. In the same way, our trials have the power to shape our faith and lead us to a greater purpose, something we can often only see after going through the difficulty. Imagine that our life is like a piece of clay in the potter's hands. Trials are like the molding process. Every pressure, every squeeze, every shape that the potter imprints on the clay is part of a process that aims to transform a simple piece of clay into a useful and beautiful vessel. If the clay had any conscience, it might find the process painful and uncomfortable, but the potter knows that it is necessary for the end result. In the same way, God, our potter, uses trials to shape us, to transform us, and to perfect us, making us more like Christ. Difficulties produce perseverance because they teach us to hope and trust in God, even when we don't understand why we are going through certain situations. And this perseverance, in turn, makes us complete. As James says, that you may be mature, and complete, lacking in nothing. It's not that difficulties are good in themselves, but what God does in us through them is good. When we allow trials to play their part, we come out of them stronger, more resilient and closer to God. James' invitation is for us to change our perspective. When we look at challenges as opportunities for growth and let God work in us during these moments, we can find joy. Not because we are suffering, but because we know that this suffering is producing something valuable in us. It's like a runner who, when facing fatigue during training, rejoices because he knows that each effort is preparing him for the race, making him more resilient and faster. So trials are opportunities for us to develop perseverance, and perseverance shapes our character. In every difficult situation, God is shaping and strengthening us, teaching us to trust Him in all things. By trusting in God's greater purpose for us, we can indeed find joy, even in the midst of difficulties. Because, in the end, we are not alone. We have a God who works in us and through us, turning every trial into another step on the journey of faith and resilience. So remember, every challenge you face is an opportunity to grow, a chance to become stronger and to allow God to work on your character. The joy that James mentions is not the superficial joy that denies pain, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that God is doing something good in you, even in difficult circumstances. Trust in the process, persevere, and allow God's grace to transform you, strengthening your faith and making you more resilient and mature. Number 6, God works all things together for good. In Romans 8:28, Paul brings us a promise that is a source of consolation and hope for Christians. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to His purpose. This statement doesn't mean that only good things will happen to us, but that God, in His wisdom and love, is able to transform even the most adverse situations to produce something good and meaningful in our lives. Trusting that God transforms even negative circumstances is one of the greatest challenges of faith, especially when we are in the middle of a storm and everything seems to be falling apart. When we face pain, loss, or times when the path seems dark, it can be hard to believe that there is anything good that can come out of all that difficulty. However, Paul assures us that for those who love God, nothing is out of His control, and no event, no matter how tragic or painful, is exempt from the possibility of being used for a greater purpose. The secret to understanding this promise lies in trusting God's vision, which goes beyond what we can see at the moment. God not only sees the whole picture, He also knows how each piece, even the most painful ones, will fit together to form a beautiful and meaningful work. We can imagine our life as a large mosaic made up of small pieces, each representing an experience, a phase of life. Some of these pieces are bright and cheerful, while others are dark and difficult. But in the end, when all the pieces are put together, God forms a picture that is beautiful and meaningful, a masterpiece that only makes sense when seen as a whole. A practical example of this can be found in many stories of overcoming and transformation. Think of someone who has lost a job and felt helpless and directionless. At the time of the loss, the feeling is one of failure, of an uncertain future. But over time, that person discovers a new opportunity, something they would never have considered if they hadn't gone through that difficulty. It could be a new career path, a new talent discovered, or even a new way of serving and helping other people. Sometimes, what seemed like a closed door becomes the opening to something much bigger and more significant. Another example can be found in situations of illness. Many people who have experienced a serious illness report that the period was extremely difficult, marked by fear and pain. However, many also testify that during this journey they discovered a new meaning to life, a new appreciation for simple and precious things, and even a greater intimacy with God that they would never have experienced otherwise. Adversity was the channel that led them to a deeper relationship with the Creator. And this, in a mysterious way, became a greater good than the suffering they faced. God works all things for good, even if we can't immediately see or understand it. Joseph, in the Old Testament, is a great example of this truth. Sold out by his own brothers, unjustly accused and imprisoned, Joseph had every reason to believe that his life would not have a happy outcome. But in all the suffering, God was working to bring him to a position where he would save many lives, including that of his own family. In the end, he was able to say to his brothers, "You have dealt evil against me, but God has turned it to good." Genesis 50:20. This is the kind of faith that Romans 8:28 invites us to develop. Not a faith that ignores pain, but a faith that believes that despite the pain, God is doing something good. The good is not always immediate, nor is it always visible during the process, but it is certain, because God is faithful and His word is true. Our part is to trust, to believe that in the end, even what has brought us tears can be transformed into something that will bring growth, wisdom, and even joy. So, when we face the adversities of life, we can choose to trust that God is working in all of this for our good. We may not see the work complete now. We may not even understand how something so difficult can turn into something good, but we can be sure that God is at work. And when we look back in retrospect, we will see how every difficulty had a purpose, how every challenge was another step towards something greater that God was preparing for us. So Romans 8:28 reminds us that our hope is not in avoiding problems, but in trusting that God is able to use each one to strengthen us, to perfect us, and to shape us according to His purpose. He wastes no pain, no moment of suffering. In His hands, everything is transformed, everything works together for our good, and it is this trust that gives us peace and the strength to carry on, even when the winds are against us. God is able to make even the deserts of our lives blossom, and that is the greatest hope we can carry with us. Number 7, the riches of having the Lord as our fortress. In Psalm 73, verse 26, the psalmist Asaph declares a deeply comforting truth. "Though my flesh and my heart fail, God is the strength of my heart and my inheritance forever." These words speak to a reality that we all experience at some point in our lives. There are times when our physical and emotional strength fails us. Exhaustion, pain, frustrations, and the weight of circumstances can make us feel completely drained. However, this verse reminds us that even when we reach our limits, there is a source of strength that never fails, and that strength comes from God. Having God as our fortress means that our true strength does not depend on our body or our emotions, which are volatile and limited. The body is susceptible to fatigue, illness, and aging, and our emotions often take us from high to low as circumstances change. Asaph, the author of the psalm, expresses the reality of being human. Our body and heart, our physical and emotional strength have limits, and sometimes these limits are reached faster than we would like. But even in those moments, God remains the fortress of our hearts. He is the unshakable rock on whom we can rely. We can imagine our life as a house built on land, subject to storms and strong winds. If that house doesn't have a solid foundation, it will easily be blown down by any storm. In the same way, if our life is based solely on our own strength, be it physical, emotional, or mental, it will be vulnerable to life's ups and downs. But if our foundation is the Lord, if He is our fortress, even when everything seems to be falling apart, we will find stability because He is immutable. God being our fortress doesn't mean that we won't go through moments of weakness or difficulty. On the contrary, it means that in those moments, there is an inner strength that sustains us in a way that goes beyond what the world offers. This strength is not based on our ability to resist, but on a deep communion with God. It is an intimate relationship that gives us the confidence that even if all other sources of strength fail, He is there, constant, firm, secure. Spiritual resilience is precisely this ability to remain standing, even when all the evidence tells us to give up. It is a strength that comes from within, but not because we are strong on our own, but because we surrender to God's presence in us. Jesus, while He was here on earth, often withdrew to pray, to be in communion with the Father. He left us an example of where true strength comes from, not from our human ability, but from intimate communion with God. We can think of God as a spring of living water. Imagine we are walking through a desert where everything seems barren and lifeless. The heat of the sun and the lack of resources exhaust us, and we feel we can't take another step. But then we find a spring, clean, fresh water that renews us and allows us to continue. That's how God is for us. He is that spring in the desert. When our strength runs out, when our hearts are tired and hopeless, He gives us what we need to keep going. He renews us, strengthens us, and allows us to go on, not in our own strength, but in His. It is this intimacy with God, this deep relationship, that generates true resilience. Praying, meditating on the Word, seeking His presence daily are like drinking from this inexhaustible fountain. This helps us to remember that our strength does not come from circumstances, success, or our own ability, but from who God is. The resilience that arises from this relationship is much more than simply hanging in there. It is being renewed, being sustained by a supernatural strength that enables us to face adversity with faith, hope, and confidence. So when the psalmist says, "God is the strength of my heart," he is talking about God's presence as a sure foundation, the rock that keeps us standing when everything else seems to be crumbling. Even if our body weakens and our feelings betray us, God is there, firm, holding us up, protecting us, giving us the strength we need to carry on. This is the richness of having the Lord as our fortress. He is our refuge, our inner strength, our constant consolation. If today you feel exhausted, without physical or emotional strength, remember the psalmist's words. Your strength doesn't have to come from yourself. God is your fortress. He is by your side, ready to renew you, to be the rock you can lean on, to be the living water that quenches your spiritual thirst. Even when all else fails, God never fails. And so we can have confidence and hope, knowing that our true strength comes from Him, the one who never tires and never gives up on us. Throughout this reflection, we have realized that the true secret of strength and resilience does not lie in what we possess or in our ability to overcome challenges on our own. True strength does not lie in self-sufficiency or in a tireless effort to appear invulnerable. On the contrary, true strength and resilience come from an intimate and deep connection with Christ and trust in God's Word, which assures us of His promises and His constant presence. So, as we face life's adversities, let us be strengthened by the truth that we are not alone. Our resilience is rooted in the confidence that God is our fortress, our hope, and our sustainer. We can rest in His presence, know that He transforms even the worst situations for our good, and that in Christ we find the strength we need to carry on. True strength comes from the Lord, and that strength is unshakable, sufficient, and constant. May we always turn to Him, who is our rock, our refuge, and the inexhaustible source of all our strength.